Nobody was left at 51 years old, with a canvas bag, a widow's black dress gone gray from washing, and $4 sewn into the hem of a petticoat, when her late husband's business partner declared the mill they had built together belonged to him alone. Marcus Teal had been a patient man, or so everyone in the town of Thistle Creek believed, patient enough to wait 11 years for Otis Renner to die of a fever before producing a partnership paper that named himself sole heir to everything the two men had built along the creek, including the modest farmhouse nobody Renner had called home since her wedding day. She did not fight him, not because she believed him honest, but because she had learned, in a childhood spent moving from one relation's charity to another, that a woman without money and without a deed rarely won an argument against a man with both. She left with what she could carry, and 3 days later, standing at the edge of a public auction held to settle old county debts, she watched grown men laugh at a crumbling, flood-ravaged grist mill that no one wanted, its great wooden waterwheel half-collapsed and choked with silt, and when the auctioneer, half in jest, asked if anyone would pay even $2 for the ruin, nobody raised a hand and said she would. What she did not know, standing in the mud with a deed to a worthless mill clutched in her fist, was that behind that broken water-wheel waited something sealed away decades before her birth, something that would not only rebuild her own shattered life, but would settle a debt Thistle Creek had owed its river for 2 generations. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nobody Renner. If you have ever found yourself standing in the ruins of something everyone else had given up on, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Nobody Renner had not always carried a name that made strangers pause and ask if they had heard her correctly. She had been born Nobody in Whitfield in the spring of 1839, in a small cabin along the Tennessee side of the Cumberland Plateau, the third daughter of an itinerant preacher named Josiah Whitfield who believed, with a particular fervor of a man convinced he alone understood Scripture's deeper mathematics, that a child's name ought to reflect a spiritual truth rather than family sentiment. He had named his first daughter Mercy and his second Grace, and when his wife delivered a third girl in a year already heavy with debt and disappointment, he declared, before the midwife had even finished her work, that this child would be a living reminder that in the eyes of the Lord, the least among us and the greatest were, in truth, nobody at all before his majesty, and so he named her Nobody. And no amount of pleading from her mother or scandalized whispering from the church congregation could move him from it. She grew up answering to a name that made other children snicker and grown adults blink twice, and she learned early, out of necessity, that a person could either let a strange name diminish her or could carry it the way a soldier carries a scar, as proof of something survived rather than something shameful. Her mother, Ruth, a quiet woman with capable hands, had taught her daughters practical things a preacher considered beneath spiritual concern, how to read the sky for weather, how to keep accounts honestly down to the penny, how to mend, how to preserve, how to make a little stretch further than it had any right to. But it was Nobody's uncle, her mother's brother, a millwright named Ezra Coyle who traveled the circuit repairing grist mills and sawmills across 3 counties, who gave her the gift that would matter most decades later. Ezra had no children of his own, and on the long summer visits he made to the Whitfield cabin between jobs, he took a particular liking to Nobody, perhaps because she alone among his sisters asked endless, patient questions about the machinery he worked on, about how a river's simple, ceaseless motion could be coaxed and channeled into something that ground grain and cut timber and, in Ezra's words, turned the stubborn patience of water into the practical bread of a whole community. He taught her, over the course of many summers, how a mill race was cut and angled, how a water wheel's paddles were shaped to catch the current just so, how the gears within a mill's working heart translated that slow, powerful turning into something useful. And though she was a girl in an era that rarely imagined girls as millwrights, Ezra never once suggested her curiosity was misplaced, telling her instead that water and grain did not care what a person wore or what they were called, only whether they understood the honest mechanics of making something work. He also taught her something less tangible but, in the end, more important, a conviction he stated plainly one evening while they sat watching a repaired wheel turn steady and true after days of frustrating failure, that most things a world called ruined or worthless had simply been misunderstood by someone unwilling to look closely enough, and that patience, real patience, was not merely waiting but was a willingness to keep looking until you understood what you were actually looking at. Nobody married Otis Renner in 1858. When she was 19, and he was a serious, soft-spoken young man of 23 who had come through the Cumberland region working as a hired hand at various mills before settling, briefly, at a property near her father's church. Otis possessed none of Ezra's technical genius, but had instead a steady, unglamorous diligence and an old debt of gratitude toward Ezra Coyle, who had once given him work and a fair wage when no one else would. And it was through Ezra's household that Otis and Nobody first met, drawn to each other by shared quietness that neither found lonely in the other's company. They married with little ceremony and less money, and when the country's growing troubles finally erupted into war 3 years later, Otis, unwilling to fight for a cause he found morally indefensible yet equally unwilling to abandon a wife who needed him, spent the war years working mills further west, in the young frontier settlements pushing into Kansas and the edges of the Nebraska Territory, always one careful step ahead of conscription, always sending back what money he could. It was in 1866, with the war finally over and the country exhausted but hungry for rebuilding, that Otis and Nobody arrived together in a modest river settlement called Thistle Creek, a town of perhaps 400 souls built along a tributary of the Kansas River, drawn there by rumors that the town lacked a proper gristmill and that a man with capital and know-how could build something the whole community would depend upon for generations. Otis had saved enough, barely, to purchase a stretch of riverbank and begin construction, and it was that a local landowner named Marcus Teal, a man with considerably more capital than construction knowledge, approached Otis with a partnership proposal, offering to fund the mill's completion in exchange for half ownership, an arrangement that seemed, to a tired young couple with almost nothing else, like an answered prayer rather than the trap it would eventually prove to be. The mill they built together, which the town came to call the Thistle Creek Mill, prospered modestly for the better part of 2 decades, grinding grain for farmers across the county and slowly becoming, as such mills often did, less a business and more a fixture of the community's rhythm, a place where farmers gathered to wait their turn in trade and use, where the mill's steady mechanical heartbeat became so woven into the town's daily life that few residents could remember what Thistle Creek had sounded like before it. Nobody, meanwhile, built her own quiet reputation within the town, keeping the mill's accounts with the same scrupulous honesty her mother had taught her, tending a small garden that fed not only her own household but frequently supplemented poorer neighbors' tables during lean winters, and becoming, over the years, the person townsfolk brought their disputes to when they wanted a fair, unemotional hearing rather than the county's slow and expensive courts. She and Otis never had children, a private sorrow they rarely discussed but which drew them, in its own way, closer together, each becoming for the other the primary anchor of a life that otherwise felt increasingly precarious as Marcus Teal's involvement in the mill's daily operations grew more assertive and Otis's health, never robust, began a slow decline through his middle years. It was a catastrophic flood in the spring of 1884, the worst the region had seen in living memory, that first badly damaged the mill's great waterwheel, tearing loose several of its paddles and warping the axle beyond simple repair. And though Otis, weakened already by the winter's illness, insisted on personally overseeing the difficult repairs, the strain of the work in cold, waist-deep water proved more than his failing constitution could bear, and he took to his bed with a fever that autumn, from which he never fully recovered, dying in the spring of 1885, leaving Nobody a widow of 4 to 6 with a half share in a mill she had helped keep running for 2 decades but whose deed, she would soon discover, told a very different story than the life she believed she had built. The fall that stripped Nobody of everything she had spent her adult life building began not with Otis's death itself, painful as that loss was, but with what followed in the weeks after, when Marcus Teal, whom she had trusted as her husband's partner and, she believed, her own friend, produced a partnership agreement from a locked strongbox that named himself, through a technical clause concerning the original financing of the mill's construction, as sole owner should Otis die without. Surviving male issue, a clause Otis had apparently signed in the desperate early days of the partnership without fully understanding its implications, trusting Marcus's assurance that it was merely standard legal formality. Nobody contested it as best she could, walking the difficult miles to the county seat to consult what lawyer would see a widow with no fee to offer, but the clause, however unjust in spirit, proved airtight in the letter of county law, and within 3 months of Otis's death, Marcus Teal held full legal title to the mill, the millhays, and the modest farmhouse Nobody had called home for 19 years, informing her, with a particular gentleness men sometimes use when delivering the cruelest news, that he could not in good conscience allow sentiment to interfere with sound business, and that she would need to vacate the property by the month's end. Nobody spent that final month doing what she had always done in hardship, working methodically rather than despairing, taking in mending and laundry from families she had helped through harder winters than this one, though the sum she earned amounted to little more than survival money, and selling what furniture and household goods she could not carry. Until the morning arrived when she walked away from the only home she had shared with her husband, carrying a single canvas bag containing her clothes, her mother's sewing kit, a small portrait of Otis, and $4 sewn carefully into her petticoat hem, the last remnant of a life that had, until recently, seemed solid and secure. She had been staying, in the weeks since, in a spare room above the Thistle Creek Mercantile, offered grudgingly by the shopkeeper's wife in exchange for help with the store's accounts, when word reached her that the county was holding a public auction to settle debts on several abandoned or foreclosed properties along the river, and among the parcels listed, almost as an afterthought at the very bottom of the auctioneer's sheet, sat a flooded, long-abandoned mill house 3 miles upstream. From Thistle Creek proper, a property that had belonged, decades earlier, to a reclusive miller named Absalom Krieg, who had died without heirs sometime in the 1870s. His mill left to rot in the years since, its waterwheel collapsed and half-submerged, its structure so thoroughly claimed by silt and river growth that most Thistle Creek residents had half forgotten it existed at all. Nobody attended the auction not with any real intention of buying, but simply because the gathering offered free coffee and a chance to be among people rather than alone above the mercantile with her grief, and it was only when the auctioneer reached the Krieg Mill parcel near the day's end, and the assembled crowd broke into open laughter at the very suggestion that anyone would want such a ruin, that something old and stubborn in nobody, some echo of her Uncle Ezra's voice insisting that most ruined things had simply been misunderstood, made her raise her hand when the auctioneer, more as a joke than a genuine offer, asked whether anyone present would pay even $2 for the property. The crowd's laughter turned briefly toward her, a widow with nothing bidding on a ruin that had defeated even the county's patience. But the auctioneer, finding no other takers even at that absurd price, brought down his gavel, and nobody ran or walked away from that auction owning, for the sum of 2 of her 4 remaining dollars, a flooded, forgotten mill house that not a single other soul in Thistle Creek believed held any value whatsoever. She walked the 3 miles upstream the following morning, the last of her dollar bills folded carefully into her shoe, carrying only her mother's old sewing kit and a determination she could not fully explain even to herself. And when she first laid eyes on the Krieg Mill in full daylight, her heart sank in a way the auction's excitement had not prepared her for. The building leaned badly to one side, its lower timbers black with decades of rot, and the mill race that had once channeled the creek's current toward the wheel had silted over so thoroughly that the water now simply slid past the structure entirely, leaving the great wooden water wheel stranded and half-collapsed in mud rather than turning in a proper current, its remaining paddles green with moss and one whole section of its rim broken away entirely, exposing the wheel's inner hub and axle to open air and weather. She spent that first morning simply walking the property's perimeter, doing what Ezra Coyle had taught her decades earlier, looking closely rather than looking away, and it was in that careful circling of the ruined wheel, examining the axle housing where the wheel met the millstone foundation, that she noticed something the collapsed section of rim had, in its very failure, revealed a narrow gap in the foundation stones directly behind the wheel's hub, too regular and deliberate to be simple erosion, a space that appeared, on closer inspection, to be a hollow chamber built directly into the mill's foundation wall, accessible only from the awkward angle now exposed by the wheel's collapse, an angle that would have been entirely hidden from view for as long as the wheel turned properly in its housing. It took her the better part of that first week, working alone with a borrowed crowbar and the patient, methodical persistence her mother and uncle had both instilled in her, to clear enough of the silt and broken timber away from the wheel's base to properly access that hidden chamber, and when she finally worked loose the flat stone that sealed its opening, she found inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and was now brittle and crumbling at the edges, a modest collection of ledgers and personal papers, along with a small iron strong box whose lock, remarkably, had survived the years of damp far better than she expected. Reading by lantern light in the mill's dry upper loft that evening, having pried the strong box open with considerable effort, nobody began to understand why Absalom Krieg, the reclusive miller who had built this place, had chosen to seal something so carefully into a chamber accessible only when his mill's wheel failed, a possibility he had apparently anticipated with the same careful mind that had led him to hide it there in the first place. The ledgers told a story stretching back to the years immediately following the war, when Absalom Krieg, then a younger man newly settled along this stretch of river, had discovered, through his position grinding grain for farmers across the county, a pattern of systematic fraud being carried out by the county's land assessment office, a scheme in which certain assessors, working with a small circle of wealthy landowners, had deliberately undervalued specific parcels of prime river adjacent farmland before those same landowners quietly purchased the undervalued land themselves, then had the assessment corrected upward once ownership transferred, profiting enormously at the expense of the original farming families who sold believing they were receiving fair value. Krieg, in his careful ledgers, had documented dozens of these transactions across nearly a decade, cross-referencing county assessment records with actual sale prices and subsequent reassessments, building a meticulous case against a fraud that had, by his own estimate, cost more than 30 families across the county their land's true wealth. A fraud whose beneficiaries included several names still prominent and respected in Thistle Creek's affairs, and whose central figure, listed again and again across Krieg's careful documentation as the assessor who had personally falsified the majority of these valuations, was a young clerk named Marcus Teal, decades before he had ever approached Otis Renner with his partnership proposal. The justice that followed was, as such reckonings in small communities often are, more a matter of shifted trust and quiet consequence than formal punishment, though no less real for that reshaping. Teal's standing collapsed within a single season, farmers who had once deferred to his judgment on county matters now refusing him a hearing, and when 3 of the defrauded families, emboldened by nobody's documented proof, brought formal legal challenges against his original land claims, Teal found himself forced into a settlement that returned significant portions of disputed acreage, including, at last, clear and undisputed title to the original mill parcel, which the settlement, after considerable legal wrangling that nobody pursued with the same patient thoroughness she brought to everything, restored not to Teal but to Otis Renner's rightful widow, the fraudulent original partnership clause having been built, it turned out, upon land Teal himself had never legitimately owned to begin with. Nobody did not use Absalom Krieg's gold coin, once the settlement concluded, to simply rebuild her own comfortable life and walk away from Thistle Creek's troubles, though her circumstances would certainly have justified such a choice after so much loss. Instead, remembering both her Uncle Ezra's patient conviction that ruined things were usually only misunderstood, and Krieg's own quiet hope that his hidden evidence would find someone willing to use it wisely, she used a portion of the recovered coin to properly repair the Krieg Mill's Waterwheel, restoring it to working order for the first time in over a decade, and opened it, with the help of 2 young men from families her testimony had helped vindicate, as a second working grist mill for the county's growing farming community, one whose ownership and profit she structured, in Krieg's own spirit of unclaimed generosity, to include a standing arrangement providing free grinding services each season for any family that had been touched by the old assessment fraud, a quiet, ongoing restitution that required no further courtroom battles to accomplish. The original Thistle Creek Mill, restored to her name through the settlement, she leased to the very same young men she had helped establish at the Krieg Mill, ensuring both structures remained working, purposeful fixtures of a community that had once been so ready to laugh her out of a public auction. It is worth remembering, now, how this story began, with a 51-year-old widow standing at a county auction with $4 sewn into a petticoat hem, raising her hand to bid on a flooded, collapsing mill house that every other soul in Thistle Creek had already written off as worthless beyond even the county's patience. They had looked at nobody Renner in the weeks after her husband's death and seen only an unfortunate widow with a peculiar name and no remaining claim on anyone's sympathy, and they had looked at the ruined Krieg Mill on the river's edge and seen only a rotting relic not worth the $2 it eventually sold for. Both judgments mistook damage for worthlessness, mistook a wheel that had simply stopped turning for a structure with nothing left inside it to offer. What waited behind that broken water wheel was never merely coin, though the coin mattered enormously to a woman who had walked away from her home with almost nothing. What waited there was one careful, frightened man's decades-old attempt to set right a wrong he had lacked the courage to expose himself, entrusted finally, by nothing more than chance and a widow's stubborn refusal to look away from ruin, to the one person capable of finishing what he had started. Nobody Renner, dismissed and disbelieved, became the one who carried that unfinished justice the last necessary distance, and in doing so she gave her town back something no amount of coin alone could have provided, proof that a name meant to diminish a person, and a name others had given up on entirely, could both, in the right hands, turn out to mean something far greater than anyone standing at that laughing auction had ever imagined. Thank you for spending this time with Nobody's Story and with all of ours here tonight. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need the reminder that what the world calls ruined and what is truly without value are never quite the same thing. Before you go, we would love to know, What is a time you found real worth in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comment below. We read every single one. Until next time, stay close.